Hi, this is Trevor Lockwood with a word of the week. And this week I thought perhaps we could look at that much abused word, the one that's on everybody's lips as a result of the big society, and that is community. What do we mean by that very word, community? Well, in biological terms, I suppose it's interacting organisms. Whoa! Sharing an environment in which they all live. Start to look at us humans and other things get in the way. It's our intent, our belief, maybe the resources that we use, our needs, our preferences, the risks that we take collectively together, all come together to create that sense of community. And it's part of our identity, isn't it? I don't want to get into a deep debate about what sociologists may call it. They take some time to come to an agreement about anything. That's the great thing about being a sociologist, really, isn't it? You can talk about it, a bit like philosophy. We could start off by saying that the word community comes from the old French, communité, which in itself comes from Latin communitas, which means cum means with or together, and minus is a gift. So we had this very broad term for a fellowship or an organised society. And of course, listening as you are, perhaps, on the internet, we've lost those geographical boundaries that we once thought determined our community, our village, our parish, our county, our country, our people, our language. It's all over the world, isn't it? I will go back to Ferdinand Tönnies, who came up with Gemeinschaft and Gesellschaft, terms much beloved by those sociologists. Gemeinschaft is translated as community, whereas Gesellschaft is a society or an association. There's a difference between the two. On the one hand, Gemeinschaft may well be labelled with families and kinship, and these are perfect expressions for Gemeinschaft, as would a place be, the fact that we all live in a particular village or we all associate or are linked to a particular religion. Great. Gesellschaft, on the other hand, is perhaps going to be used more in future because it is also concerned with self-interest. People, the individuals, are motivated to take part in a group purely by self-interest, is what Gesellschaft tends to suggest. And is that what big society is about? Is that what volunteering will become as the time goes on? That moves us on to think about things like social capital, social gain. Because if a community exists, as we're now seeing in places like Egypt and Tunisia, does freedom and security also exist? We've seen over the last few days how a community can take on a life of its own, not only to bring down a regime, as in Tunisia, but also, as we're increasingly seeing in both countries and elsewhere, other groups forming quite quickly to protect their own interests, to stop looters, to build a mini-society when the established methods of control have disappeared. In the West here, we're supposed to be losing that whole idea of community, which is probably where the big society is trying to rebuild us, as the churches and other institutions ceasing to have quite the influence that they once had. It is suggested that people need three places. They need a home in which to live, obviously, and to share with a close family. They need an office or a place of work where they can create another set of linkages. And they also need a community hangout or a gathering place. We're unlucky here in Felixstowe that we don't really have anywhere like that. And yet, across the rest of Suffolk, you will find even the smallest villages having some sort of village hall, a community centre of some sort. That widens it all out, doesn't it? What do we do? What do we want from the town in which we live? We're now talking about selling off all the woodland, selling off large tracts of publicly owned woodland. There's an outcry about that because people care about public spaces and protection. To try and replace that in some way, we're being encouraged to form independent bookshops, community centres, to take over the local libraries, and other innovative ways of creating social capital. We'll have to wait and see whether they work. One of the great weaknesses of the removal of the public interest through councils and government is that at present it's being done in order to save money, which presupposes that volunteers will work for nothing, do things for nothing, that they don't cost anything. But of course they do. They cost quite a lot. They need somewhere to meet. They'll need chairs, electricity, clothing, perhaps, training invariably, and encouragement in various ways, even if they're not paid. Ideally, their travelling expenses should be paid. Their refreshment should be given to them for nothing. And so we move on. It's probable that there are at least 4 different elements that build up this sense of community. Being a member of an organisation of some sort, having some influence. And that's possibly where our present political structures have broken down, because many of us don't feel as if we've got any influence. And an integration and fulfilment of needs as we recognise them, as we see them. You've got to get something out of it. And it becomes, as you grow those friendship links by working together in a community, there's shared emotional connections. These very ideas of community and a sense of community created a social philosophy which was based on communitarianism. This was a philosophy that was opposed to classical liberalism and capitalism and advocated the civil society. It wasn't hostile to socialism, but it was totally different, had a different emphasis. And it shifted the focus of interest towards the community and societies and away from the individual. We've had 2 or 3 decades now where the individual has taken precedence. Maybe as the state removes its services, we will have to come together more than we have done in the recent past. Now, from a community media point of view, that becomes very important to us, because if you're going to build any sort of community, you need effective communication. And so, these days, with mobile phones, with the internet, taking precedence over the local newspaper or whatever it may be, we believe that our function becomes that much more important. Because the members of a group, any group, depend on a flow of information to establish their own identity and to learn to function as a group. Now, we all fail in some way or another. We don't turn up to the events organised by the groups that we say that we've got some allegiance to, but nevertheless, we are aware they're happening. And it is important, particularly as we see our young people walking about the streets increasingly with mobile phones in their hands, texting each other, but yet when they're approached, you find that communication with them may not be that easy. It's grunts and a language that older people like me, at least, don't always understand. So encouraging them to come together to join in can be good news. I was part of a training session with all of the emergency services this week, in which we had 100 children, various ages, involved. And we flooded Felixstowe. Theoretically, that's all. We flooded Felixstowe. The important thing that came out of that whole day, that all of the children mentioned, and we had all of the children up on their feet with a microphone in their hand telling us what they thought, the great contribution the day had made for them was that they had met people and had to work with people that they didn't know. We split all the groups up, all the schools were sitting in different ways. And that was the one message that the kids had taken from the day. In some respects, you could forget the flooding. It was far more important for them to realise that actually they could have a good time with people they didn't know.